My guest today is Mrs. Dora Kim of the Korean American community, and our subject for today is on her memories of her life experiences in San Francisco as a member of this Korean American community. Good morning, Dora.
Good morning.
Dora, I understand your mother and father came from Korea. Can you tell us about their coming and a little bit about what happened then and your family and your husband and your 5 accomplished children and the kind of activities that you have done within San Francisco and also the Korean American community?
Yes, sounds like a tall order, but first, my father came over in 1903 as a railroad laborer, and then my mother came in 1920 as a picture bride. And of course, I'm going to further date myself by saying that I graduated from Girls High School in San Francisco, which was the only public school for girls at that time.
Yeah, where was that located?
It's still located at Geary and Scott, which is now the building is still there, which is now the Benjamin Franklin Junior High School.
Oh, isn't that nice? Is that near Chinatown?
No, that's
No.
I guess it's called Western Addition area.
I see. Thank you.
It's a block below Divisadero and Geary Boulevard near Kaiser Hospital. And my children, who were all born in San Francisco, had the same grammar school teachers at Gene Parker School, which is also still located and going strong. It's on Broadway between Powell and Mason.
Oh, that's really interesting. And what does your husband do?
And my husband he retired about 10 years ago as a marine engineer after 20 years of service with Matson Navigation Company. And now he's working for the city as a senior stationary engineer.
Isn't that nice? And can you tell us about your children and what they have done in the Korean community?
Okay, my oldest son, Tom, is the field coordinator for the Asian American Mental Health Training Program, and he's also the executive director of the Korean Community Service Center. And my oldest daughter, Darlene, is an employment development officer with the state employment development department and is currently on loan to the mayor's youth program. And my number 3 is a respiratory therapist at Mary's Help Hospital. And my number 4 and 5 are still, I call them perpetual college students.
Oh, that's really wonderful. Dora, can you tell us a little bit about your mother and father's life here?
Yes. If you notice, there was a gap in the years. My father first came over as a laborer in 1903, and when the contract work was over, there were more men here than women, and of course they were allowed to stay here, and then they were able to bring females over as brides, but there was no way except through exchange of pictures. And so in 1920, that's how my mother came over, as an exchange of pictures. And I recall the stories that my mother told of coming over on the ship with other picture brides. And if you recall, I still remember the stories that she told. Of course, there were no airplanes then, and the ships had no stabilizers. And it took them, it was something like 23 to 24 days to cross the ocean. And without the stabilizers, apparently all the women got seasick. And they could care less. They were so sick at the time, they could care less whether they got to America, to the land of opportunity. But somehow they arrived, and at first, most of the Koreans sort of headed toward the Central Valleys. There were no opportunities for them here. and they headed toward the Central Valleys, like little cities, country towns like Ridley, Danuba, Sanger, uh, outside of Fresno. And they ended up doing farm work. Then some of the braver ones, like my father, ventured back to San Francisco, and they started into little stores, like into business. And for instance, my father first had a little cigar stand on the corner of, what was it, Pacific and Kearney, which was the old Barbary Coast in San Francisco. And then a few years later, he added a restaurant to a corner cigar stand on the corner of Jackson and Kearney, which was right on the outskirts of so-called Chinatown. And he remained there until, I guess it was right after World War II, so that was in 1942 when he sold the business and retired. And during that time, we lived in an apartment. It was on Jackson near Stockton Street, and there was a Bondry apparently right there. And then sometime later in the 30s, I guess it took him about 30 years in order to save the money after hard work in order to buy a place. And I remember at that time, we couldn't even rent a place large enough for our growing family. I had two brothers, and they needed a room of their own. And we attempted to rent places, and of course, they weren't renting flats to Orientals as we were known then. So then my father attempted to purchase a pair of flats on Mason Street. And now there were no Orientals on Mason Street at that time. And when we did close escrow, then we discovered that aliens were not allowed to buy and own property at the time. And I was not of age, even though I was born here. So we had to buy the property in the agent's name, who happened to be Italian. And so it was kept in his name until I became 21 years of age, which was like 7 years later. And another incident years later when he tried to, in fact, he purchased a small apartment building on Jones Street, which is known as Nob Hill. And I remember getting a letter from the Nob Hill Association, welcoming us to the neighborhood and inviting us to one of their meetings, and would we help them in their fight to keep the Orientals out from their neighborhood. And of course, we've come a long way since then.
Oh, Dora, I'll say. And that's good. Dora, some of the things that you have done, you have just recently retired after having been worked with the personnel of the state of California for 23 years, retired with honor and all glory. And now you are working with the meals program at the Korean Community Service Center.
Right. Yes, I retired after 23 years with the State Department of Employment.
Mm-hmm.
And last year, and I retired on 7/7/77.
Oh.
I just arbitrarily picked that date.
Arbitrarily picked it.
And since then, people have said, well, gee, what are you going to do now? And I said, I've been busier than ever and not getting paid as much. But and now I'm involved in the Korean Community Center in the Korean senior citizens. And we have a hot meal program there. We serve hot meals under the Self-Help for the Elderly's interethnic meal program to 30 senior citizens. We have a very limited space there. And in fact, out of the 7 meal sites under the Self-Help for the Elderly interethnic meal program, ours is the only site that has on-site cooking. In other words, we're the only ones that cook on the site, and we serve all Korean meals, and whereas all the others sites have catered meals.
Dora, I've been there, and the food is delightful, and I had a very special, wonderful occasion to help celebrate the 100th birthday of one of your senior citizens who is really in wonderful health for the years and everything. And we had such fun that day. A letter to him from our president, United States president, and Art Agnos from our community, and a letter from Senator Marks. And it was really quite a thrilling experience. He told us that he came here in 1906, the day of the earthquake.
Right. He arrived here the day of the earthquake, and my father was here that day also. And I remember my father saying that he got on a ferry boat and went over to Oakland that day. But Mr. Yang, who just celebrated his 100th birthday, and he's still alert, and he exercises every day. He comes to the meals center every day. And he was also one that had a restaurant business, and he was known as Uncle Sam to his customers.
Uh-huh.
And I also recall, of course, we were all situate in and around Chinatown. And not too long ago, somebody asked me, why did you stay in Chinatown? As if we had a choice. And some of the other businesses that the Koreans, of course, when I was growing up in San Francisco, you have to remember that there weren't more than, I guess, 100 of us. Because I remember in 1906, the Korean Methodist Church was started by a Reverend Daniel Lee with 50 members, which was a total Korean population at that time. And of course, it still stands. The new church is still standing on Powell Street, right next to the Chinatown Library on Powell between Jackson and Washington. And some of the other businesses were, let's see, there were a couple more restaurants. There were several cleaning shops, a couple of barber shops. And I recall one of the sons of the cleaning shop owner grew to be a brilliant doctor. And in fact, he was a head pathologist for the University of California Medical Center. And he was a chief pathologist in the coroner's office for over 25 years. And there was a police reporter on that beat all that time, and he said he just took it for granted that he was Chinese. And apparently that was the way it was with us at that time, even though we had been here since the turn of the century. And in other words, we're still asked whether we're Japanese or Chinese. And when we say we're Korean, more often than not, they'll say, the next question is, what's that? And yet we have to tell them, gee, we have our own country, which is located between China and Japan. We have a history that dates back over 4,000 years. We have our own food. We have our own language.
And we're having an art exhibit, a Korean art exhibit.
That's right.
When?
There's 5,000 years of art treasures that'll be coming to the Asian Art Museum in May of 1979, and which will be here a month before the King Tut's exhibit.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really nice. We're going to have a real cultural year. Dora, one of your own personal accomplishments was there is a problem when nurses, for instance, registered nurses come in from another country. They do have to take a state board examination and also to qualify for it. And I understand that, and also they come here to work and they work as nurses' aides in a hospital, and that you worked with the Board of Nurses registration and with the San Francisco Community College, and organized classes that would help them make up for their deficiencies, and readied these young ladies for the state board, which they passed, and became registered nurses and helped themselves economically and helped our care of our people in the health field.
I think I'll have to go back a little and mention how this all happened. As I mentioned before, when I was growing up, there weren't more than 100 of us. Then they relaxed the immigration laws in 1965, and then the influx of the Korean immigrants began. But they really didn't start coming over until about 1970, 71. And then at that time, I guess the U.S. Immigration Office said that in cooperation with the Korean government said, I guess the professionals can now go over on what they call a professional visa. In other words, you do not need to have a friend or a sponsor in the States. So as a result, a large number of pharmacists, registered nurses, and civil engineers started to come over in that order. And in my job at the Department of Employment was where I encountered them daily. And they would come in naturally looking for work. And so the first thing I would do is give them an application, a work application to fill out. This they do beautifully. And then when I start to interview them, I discovered that they just couldn't communicate verbally. And that was a shock to me. And in the case of a pharmacist, of course, this was before I had known that the professionals could come over on a professional visa. And I asked him, I said, what did you do in Korea? And he tried to tell me that he was a pharmacist, but he couldn't pronounce the word pharmacist. And it sounded something like pomace. And I just couldn't make it out. So finally I said, well, spell it for me. Can you spell it? And he spelled it. And it was, I said, a pharmacist. Then it dawned on me. Pharmacist, the PH has a F sound. And in Korean language, there is no such letter as F or R, an L maybe, and V, a few of those letters. And so as a result, they just, to this day, they have a difficult time pronouncing any words with those letters in it. And for instance, my office was on Turk and Fillmore, and they would get on a bus, and this is where survival English really comes in. And they learned to say how much. They didn't know what the fare was. And the bus driver would gruffly say, quarter. Well, they had never heard the word quarter. If the bus driver said 25 cents, they would probably understand. So then I would have to say, well, a quarter meant 25 cents, and you had to put an even change in. Then even trying to get off the bus, they would get in the back. They see the sign, get off in the rear. They get in the back, and nothing happened. And I remember one of the engineers said, somebody kept saying, step down. They stepped down. And he didn't know what that meant. And those are the phrases that, you just don't learn in school.
Yes, that's...
And so anyway, so I had to start a class, and really, it was really like teaching them how to pronounce the words so that they can be understood. And then one would say, gosh, the Americans speak so fast, I can't understand them. Then I said, well, then I had to teach them how to say something like, I said, what sounds easier to them? Excuse me or pardon me? I said, with a lift at the end. I said, they'll repeat it. And if they don't, then I taught them how to say, can you say that a little slower, or can you repeat that, or speak a little slower, please? And then they would come back and say, gee, I said that, and they did speak slower, and I did understand them.
That's wonderful. Dora, aside from your wonderful work in the Korean community, there's 4 generations of you now.
Yes, my parents would be the first. I would make up the second generation with my 2 brothers, and my 5 children would be the 3rd generation, and my 3 grandchildren are the 4th generation in San Francisco, and they were all born in San Francisco.
Well, you're a wonderful example of a contributing member to a community. In 1951, I think, there was an organization established in San Francisco called United Nationalities of San Francisco.
Oh, yes.
And you were the founding secretary. and there were several important charter members, and we have honorary members. And you are on the board of directors now. And can you tell us about the beginning of that? I think there were 100
Yes.
Koreans then, and there are about 10,000 Koreans now.
Now, I'll have to go back a little. And I remember that was in 1949 when San Francisco was celebrating its 100th birthday. And San Francisco being the cosmopolitan city it is, all the ethnic communities were invited to participate. And the Koreans, for the first time, were invited since we had a Korean consulate general's office. It was right after right after World War II. So we had a consul general, and I represented the small Korean community. Then after the celebration was over, we felt, gee, what a shame to break up and not see each other again. So there was just a handful of us. I remember Eugene Giraldo and Lucy Lenson from the Spanish community, and there was Mary Hatzes and Nicholas Loomis, and there was from the Greek community, there was Reverend Hovajimian from the Armenian, and there was Adolf Schamlefeld from the German, and just a few others. And we decided we should really get together and form an organization so that we would just remain together. And so that was how United Nationalities were born, to promote mutual understanding among all the nationality groups. And we started, and of course we gave the name United Nationalities, and now it's a representative of all the nationality groups that are in San Francisco, which numbers into hundreds.
Well, that's really very, very exciting. I really think that growth in population from 100 to 10,000 is quite dramatic.
Oh, it's hard for even me to believe me.
Dora, this has been a wonderful adventure into some of the roots of your family and their adventures and their working to contribute to the American way of life. What might be some of the problems of the immigrants coming over today from Korea?
I think I would say the main problem is the language barrier. It appears that, of course, most of the Koreans coming over are coming over with college degrees, with professional backgrounds, highly trained. And yet I even had one man who told me he taught English in Korea, and yet his spoken English appeared to be okay. So I sent him on a job, and he came back the next day, and apparently he didn't understand one word that was going on in the interview. So apparently the English they learn over there and the English that's spoken here are two different things. And another thing I noticed was that I think we use more colloquial expressions than we realize. For instance, I sent a doctor to a hospital on a janitor's job, and someone told him to get on the ball. And he started translating that in his mind, and it just didn't make sense. And then I sent another engineer to, it was a janitor's job in a glass factory. And about a week later, in the meantime, I had started survival English as a second language class in order for them to pass the initial interview in order to get a job. And of course, they would come to me and they said, well, just send me on a job. I can do the work. And I said, well, gee, but in America, they don't put you to work first. I mean, if you don't pass that initial interview because of a language barrier, you just don't get the job. And so then a week later, this man would come back and he said, gee, all day long, all I hear the men say is just shit, He said, what does that mean? And so then I found out that we have quite a few probably hundreds of classes in English as a second language, and yet not a single one is geared toward the Korean professionals that are coming over, because our so-called English classes, the emphasis is on grammar, and our Koreans apparently no grammar better than the ones that were born here. And so all they need is just conversational English. And so we've had English classes at our community center for that reason. Of course, the Proposition 13 wiped that out during the summer. But that seems to be our biggest problem.
Dora, is there problems in licensing for the MDs?
That's right. They don't they're coming over unaware of the licensing requirements here. And especially the pharmacists, there's really absolutely no job opportunities that exist for the pharmacists. The registered nurses, I've been able to place them in convalescent hospital as nurse aides, where the pay is low and the work backbreaking. And many of them would come back to me and complain, why are the American women so big and fat? Apparently there's no big and fat woman in Korea. And these Korean nurses seem to be tiny, petite, and yet they're required to do all this heavy work as a nurse aide in America. So they're really not having it easy. And so the only thing they can do is after work, I started a refresher course for nurses so that they can pass the state board, which they're now able to take. Apparently they lack the psychiatric portion in the 5 parts to the registered nurse board exam here. And we have a Korean third-generation psychiatrist, Dr. Steve Sean, who I had get adult credentials, and so he taught them the psychiatric portion of the nursing exam, and they just diligently attended classes every night after working
Now, 1 minute.
a bad day.
1 minute. You have been listening to Memories, a program presented in cooperation with the Korean Community Service Center